The morning mist hung thick over the Pennsylvania countryside when railroad magnate Cornelius Blackwood arrived at the outskirts of Gettysburg with his entourage of servants and his prized Arabian stallion, Thunder's Pride, the horse worth more than most men earned in a lifetime, pranced nervously in the golden dawn light, its black coat gleaming with expensive oils and its silk-studded bridle catching the early sun. Blackwood had traveled from New York, specifically to witness what military experts predicted would be the decisive battle of the American Civil War. As one of the wealthiest men in the Union, he believed his presence would inspire the troops and perhaps provide him with investment opportunities in the aftermath. His arrogance knew no bounds. He had paid Confederate spies thousands of dollars for information about troop movements, thinking money could buy him both safety and glory. "Sir, the Confederate forces are moving through those hills," his aide whispered, pointing toward Seminary Ridge. Blackwood barely glanced up from adjusting his gold pocket watch, a gift from President Lincoln himself. That's when he first saw her. Sarah McKenna stood in the doorway of her family's modest farmhouse, her simple brown dress patched but clean, her auburn hair tied back with a strip of cloth. At 19, she possessed a quiet dignity that no amount of wealth could purchase. Her father's farm lay directly in the path of the approaching armies. But unlike the wealthy visitors seeking excitement, the McKenna family faced the very real prospect of losing everything. "Father, we should move the animals to the back pasture," Sarah called to her aging father, who struggled with a wounded leg from the Mexican War. Blackwood overheard and couldn't resist demonstrating his superiority. "Girl," he called out in his booming voice, "I'll pay you $50 more than your father earns in a year if you can make my Thunder's Pride bow to you. This horse has been trained by the finest horsemen in Europe and responds only to those of breeding and refinement." The challenge drew curious glances from nearby Union soldiers who had begun taking positions around the farm. Sarah looked at the magnificent but skittish animal, then at the smirking millionaire. She had grown up around horses, helping her father tend to the sturdy farm animals that were their livelihood. But this creature was unlike any she had seen. "And if I cannot," she asked quietly, "then you and your family will vacate this property immediately. I've purchased the rights to this land for the Union Army's use." He produced official-looking papers with a flourished dot as artillery rumbled in the distance, and the first Confederate scouts appeared on the horizon. Sarah McKenna faced a choice that would intertwine her fate with one of the bloodiest battles in American history. The wealthy man expected easy victory over a simple farm girl, but he had underestimated the quiet strength that comes from a life of honest labor and genuine compassion. Thunder's Pride reared and snorted, foam dripping from his mouth as cannons boomed across the valley. The Battle of Gettysburg was about to begin, and with it, a personal war between privilege and humility that would determine not just the fate of one family's farm, but perhaps the very soul of a nation divided. According to historical accounts, documented in the Gettysburg Campaign by Edwin Coddington, the first shots of the battle rang out just after dawn near McPherson Ridge, where Confederate General Henry Hett's division encountered Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford. The sound of musket fire echoed across the McKenna farm as Sarah stepped toward Blackwood's magnificent but terrified stallion. Thunder's Pride had been trained for parade grounds and city streets, not battlefields. Each cannon blast made the Arabian more frantic, his eyes rolling white with terror. The expensive bridle and saddle, crafted by London's finest leather workers, seemed to burden rather than enhance the animal's natural grace. Blackwood held the lead rope tightly, his knuckles white with strain. "Go on then, farm girl," Blackwood sneered, though sweat beaded on his forehead as Confederate shells began falling closer to their position. "Show us how superior your rural wisdom is to proper breeding and training." Sarah ignored his taunts and moved slowly toward the panicked horse. She had watched her father calm spooked animals during thunderstorms, had seen how gentle patience succeeded where force failed. The battle raged beyond the ridge, but in this small space between the farmhouse and barn, time seemed suspended. "Easy, beautiful one," she whispered, extending her hand palm up. Thunder's pride snorted and backed away, but something in Sarah's voice, calm, steady, without fear, caught his attention. Unlike his master's commanding shouts, her words carried no threat, no demand for submission. Union soldiers ducked behind the stone wall that bordered the McKenna property as Confederate sharpshooters took positions in the nearby woods. Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin was among the troops using the farm as cover, and he watched the strange scene unfold between battles. "Sir," one of his sergeants whispered, "shouldn't we clear these civilians from the area?" Dawes shook his head, fascinated despite the danger. He had witnessed many displays of wealth and power, but something about this young woman's approach to the terrified animal struck him as fundamentally different. Thunder's pride pawed the ground nervously, but his ears flickered forward when Sarah began humming a gentle melody, an old Irish lullaby her grandmother had taught her. The horse's breathing gradually slowed as she continued her patient approach, never making sudden movements, never forcing eye contact. Blackwood's confidence began to waver. He had assumed the horse would either ignore the girl completely or react with hostility, proving his point about breeding and class. Instead, Thunder's pride seemed drawn to her quiet presence. "This is ridiculous," Blackwood muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Confederate artillery was growing more accurate, and shells exploded uncomfortably close to their position. Several of his servants had already sought shelter in the farmhouse cellar. Sarah continued her slow approach, speaking softly to the horse about the morning light, the smell of hay, the feel of cool earth beneath hooves, anything except the chaos of battle surrounding them. Thunder's pride lowered his head slightly, still wary but no longer actively fighting the moment, as musket volleys erupted from McPherson Ridge and the acrid smoke of gunpowder drifted across the farm. Sarah McKenna stood within arm's reach of the Millionaire's prize stallion. The horse trembled, caught between his trained responses to authority and something deeper and instinctive, recognition of genuine gentleness. The first day of Gettysburg was claiming hundreds of lives, but in this small corner of the battlefield, a different kind of conflict was reaching its climax. The Battle of Gettysburg intensified as Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee pressed their advantage against the retreating Union First Corps. Thunder's pride stood frozen between terror and fascination as Sarah extended her hand toward his muzzle. The horse's nostrils flared, taking in her scent soap made from farm lye, hay dust, and something indefinable that spoke of honest work and genuine care. Blackwood watched in growing amazement as his supposedly untouchable stallion allowed the farm girl to touch his nose. The horse's eyes, wild with panic moments before, began to soften under Sarah's gentle caress. She stroked his neck with the same tender care she showed to her family's old draft horses, speaking words of comfort that somehow carried over the din of battle. "There now, sweet one," Sarah murmured, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. You're frightened, but you're safe. No one here will hurt you. Confederate General Richard Ewell's corps was advancing through the town of Gettysburg itself, driving Union forces back toward Cemetery Hill. The sound of musket fire grew more intense, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and horses. Yet Thunder's pride seemed to find sanctuary in Sarah's presence, his breathing gradually returning to normal. Blackwood's aide tugged at his sleeve urgently. "Sir, we should retreat to a safer position. General Meade's headquarters are establishing defensive lines south of here." But Blackwood stood transfixed, watching his magnificent stallion, the horse he had paid more for than most. Families saw, in a lifetime, respond to this simple farm girl with a gentleness he had never witnessed. Thunder's pride lowered his great head, and to everyone's astonishment, the proud Arabian began to bend his front legs. "Impossible," Blackwood whispered, his face pale with shock. Sarah continued her soft murmuring, her hands now stroking the horse's neck and shoulders. Thunder's pride, despite his expensive training that emphasized dominance and control, was responding to something far more powerful, pure, uncomplicated kindness. The horse's front legs folded completely, and his magnificent head touched the ground in a gesture of complete trust and submission. Lieutenant Colonel Dawes, crouched behind the stone wall with his men, witnessed the extraordinary scene. "I've never seen anything like it," he told his sergeant. "That horse is worth more than our entire regiment's equipment, and it's bowing to a farm girl." The irony was not lost on the Union soldiers. Here, in the midst of a war that had torn the nation apart over questions of human dignity and worth, a valuable horse was demonstrating that true nobility had nothing to do with bloodlines or bank accounts. Thunder's pride remained in his bow, completely calm for the first time since the battle began. Blackwood stumbled backward, his worldview crumbling. He had always believed that money could buy anything: respect, loyalty, even love. His horse had cost him more than most people's annual income, had been trained by the most expensive experts, yet had never shown him the devotion he was witnessing now. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the artillery fire. Sarah looked up at the wealthy man, her hand still resting on Thunder's pride's neck. "He was afraid," she said simply. "Fear makes all creatures, human or animal, seek comfort. Kindness costs nothing, but it's worth everything." As Confederate forces prepared for their assault on Cemetery Hill and the Union Army regrouped for what would become one of the bloodiest battles in American history, Cornelius Blackwood faced a revelation that would change him forever. His prized stallion, symbol of his wealth and status, had bowed before a poor farmer's daughter who possessed something his millions could never purchase: genuine compassion. The wager had been won, but its true meaning was only beginning to unfold. The second day of the Battle of Gettysburg dawned with ominous clouds gathering over the blood-soaked Pennsylvania landscape. General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had spent the night positioning for what would become known as one of the most brutal assaults in American military history. Sarah McKenna had won Blackwood's wager, but the Millionaire's promised $50 seemed insignificant compared to the transformation occurring in both man and beast. Thunder's pride had spent the night in the McKenna barn, calm and content for the first time since arriving in Pennsylvania. The Arabian stallion, worth more than the entire farm, stood peacefully beside the family's old plow horse, sharing hay and water as equals. Sarah's father, Patrick McKenna, watched in wonder as his daughter tended to the magnificent animal with the same gentle care she showed all living creatures. 50 years I've been working with horses," the old farmer told his daughter, and I've never seen the like. That beast was touched by something more than training. He was touched by grace. Blackwood had spent a sleepless night wrestling with implications that went far beyond losing a simple wager. He had built his fortune on the principle that everything had a price, that superior breeding and wealth naturally commanded respect. Yet his prized stallion had shown him that true connection transcended monetary value. As dawn broke over Cemetery Ridge, where Union forces under General Meade had established their defensive positions, Blackwood approached the McKenna farmhouse. With unprecedented humility, the sounds of artillery preparation echoed across the valley as both armies positioned for the day's deadly confrontation. "Miss McKenna," he said quietly, removing his expensive silk hat, "I owe you $50. As agreed." Sarah looked at the man who had seemed so imposing just 24 hours earlier. Battle had changed everyone it touched, stripping away pretense and revealing essential character. "Keep your money, sir. Thunder's pride taught us both something, worth far more than gold." The millionaire's hands shook as he realized the magnitude of what had occurred. His entire identity had been built on the assumption that wealth equaled worth, that expensive possessions reflected superior character. Yet this poor farmer's daughter had accomplished with kindness what his money and status never could. "Then, what do you want?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Help us save the wounded," Sarah said simply. "Both armies have boys dying in these fields. Your carriages could carry them to safety. Your supplies could ease their suffering. Make your wealth. Serve life instead of pride." Throughout the morning, as General James Longstreet prepared his assault on the Union left flank at Little Round Top, an extraordinary transformation occurred at the McKenna farm. Blackwood organized his servants and carriages into an impromptu ambulance service, carrying wounded soldiers of both armies to safety. His expensive traveling coach, lined with silk and appointed with silver, became a lifeline for dying farm boys and city clerks alike. Thunder's pride, now responding to Sarah's gentle guidance, helped pull a makeshift cart filled with medical supplies. The Arabian stallion that had once pranced in Central Park now labored willingly alongside common draft horses, his pristine coat stained with honest sweat and dirt. Lieutenant Colonel Dawes, wounded in the fighting at Culp's Hill, was among those helped by Blackwood's impromptu medical corps. "I've seen many wealthy men during this war," he told Sarah as she bandaged his shoulder. "Most use their money to avoid service. This is the first time I've seen wealth serve honor." As Confederate artillery began the devastating barrage that would precede Pickett's charge, Sarah McKenna and Cornelius Blackwood worked side by side, their differences in birth and fortune rendered meaningless by shared purpose. The horse that had once symbolized the vast gulf between rich and poor now represented something far more powerful, the possibility of redemption through service to others. The bloodiest day of America's bloodiest battle was about to begin. But in one small corner of Pennsylvania, enemies had become allies, and pride had yielded to compassion. The third day of Gettysburg would be remembered as the high tide of the Confederacy, when General George Pickett's division attempted their legendary charge across nearly a mile of open ground toward Cemetery Ridge, as documented in Bruce Catton's Glory Road. This assault represented General Lee's final gamble to break Union lines and potentially end the war. For Sarah McKenna and Cornelius Blackwood, it became the ultimate test of their newfound partnership. The morning began with the largest artillery bombardment in North American history. Over 150 Confederate cannons opened fire on Union positions, creating a thunder that could be heard 50 miles away. The McKenna farm, positioned between the opposing armies, became a hellish landscape of screaming shells and exploding earth. Thunder's pride, once terrified by the sounds of battle, now stood calm beside Sarah as she organized their makeshift field hospital. The Arabian stallion had learned to ignore the cannon fire, focusing instead on the gentle voice of the woman, who had shown him that strength came not from dominance but from service. Sarah, her father called from inside the farmhouse, where they had converted the main room into a medical station. More wounded are coming from the ridge. Blackwood's transformation was complete. The man who had arrived in Gettysburg seeking glory and profit now risked his life repeatedly, driving his carriages into the killing fields to rescue fallen soldiers. His expensive clothes were torn and stained with blood. His manicured hands blistered from loading stretchers and digging graves. "Sir," one of his servants pleaded, "this is madness. We should retreat to safety." "No," Blackwood replied firmly, his voice carrying new authority born of purpose rather than privilege. "These boys are dying for something greater than themselves. The least we can do is serve something greater than our own comfort." As Pickett's charge began at 3 o'clock that afternoon, 15,000 Confederate soldiers advanced across the open field in one of the most magnificent and tragic spectacles in military history. Union artillery and rifle fire cut down the advancing ranks like wheat before a scythe. But still they came, their battle flags streaming in the summer wind. Sarah watched from the farmhouse window as the grey line approached Cemetery Ridge. Among the attacking soldiers she could see boys barely older than herself, their faces set with desperate determination. These were not faceless enemies, but someone's sons, brothers, fathers, young men caught up in forces beyond their control. "We must help them too," she told Blackwood, who stood beside her watching the slaughter unfold. "They're the enemy," one of the Union soldiers protested. "They're dying boys," Sarah replied simply. "Pain doesn't choose sides." Thunder's pride proved invaluable during the aftermath of Pickett's charge. His aristocratic breeding, once a symbol of separation from common folk, now enabled him to move swiftly across the battlefield while carrying wounded soldiers to safety. The horse that had cost more than most people's lifetime earnings became a lifeline for farm boys and city clerks alike, regardless of the color of their uniforms. Blackwood found himself kneeling beside a young Confederate soldier, barely 18, who had been shot through the chest during the charge. The boy's uniform marked him as one of Pickett's Virginians, part of the legendary division that had come so close to breaking Union lines. "Water," the soldier whispered, his eyes glazing with approaching death, without hesitation. Blackwood lifted his own silver drinking cuppa, gift from the mayor of New York, to the dying enemy's lips. The irony was not lost on him. He was using his most precious possessions to comfort those he had originally come to see defeated. "What's your name, son?" Blackwood asked gently. Thomas Garrett, sir, from Richmond." The boy's voice was barely audible. "Tell my mother. Tell her I tried to do right." As Thomas Garrett died in the arms of a Yankee millionaire, something fundamental shifted in Cornelius Blackwood's understanding of honor, sacrifice, and human worth. The Battle of Gettysburg was ending, but its true lessons were only beginning to unfold. Thunder's pride stood quietly nearby, his magnificent head lowered in what seemed like mourning for all the fallen, Union and Confederate alike. The Battle of Gettysburg ended as Independence Day dawned over a landscape transformed by 3 days of unimaginable carnage. General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia began its retreat toward the Potomac River, leaving behind over 28,000 casualties. The Union Army, though victorious, had suffered nearly as heavily in the silence that followed the guns. The true cost of America's bloodiest battle became heartbreakingly clear. Sarah McKenna stood in her family's farmyard, now a makeshift cemetery where Union and Confederate soldiers lay buried side by side. The distinction between North and South, which had seemed so important when the battle began, had dissolved in the face of shared suffering and sacrifice. Thunder's pride grazed peacefully nearby, his Arabian bloodlines and expensive training, forgotten in the simple act of finding nourishment from common Pennsylvania soil. Blackwood emerged from the farmhouse, his once immaculate appearance now bearing the honest marks of 3 days spent serving others. His silk vest was torn and stained with blood from wounded soldiers he had carried to safety. His manicured hands, once soft from a life of luxury, were now calloused from digging graves and loading stretchers. 43 Union boys, 37 Confederate, he reported to Sarah, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. All of them barely old enough to shave. All of them somebody's precious child. The transformation in both man and horse had become complete. Thunder's pride, once a symbol of wealth and status, now worked willingly alongside the McKenna family's draft. Horses, pulling carts loaded with supplies for the wounded. The Arabian stallion that had been trained to respond only to commands from those of proper breeding, now answered to Sarah's gentle voice above all others. Patrick McKenna, despite his wounded leg, had worked tirelessly alongside his daughter, and the Millionaire to tend the wounded and bury the dead. The old farmer had watched Blackwood's evolution with the wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst of human nature. Money didn't make that man, he told Sarah as they watched Blackwood distribute his remaining supplies to departing soldiers, but losing his pride did. Sometimes a man has to fall before he can truly rise. News of the Union victory was spreading across the North. But for those who had witnessed the battle's reality, celebration seemed impossible. The cost in human life had been too high for triumphant rejoicing. Instead, there was a somber recognition that the nation would need healing as much as it needed victory. Thunder's pride approached Sarah as she tended to a wounded Confederate sergeant who had been too injured to retreat with Lee's army. The horse nuzzled her shoulder gently, seeking the comfort of her presence. In 3 days, the proud Arabian had learned what his expensive training had never taught him, that true nobility came not from dominance but from service, not from breeding but from character. Miss McKenna, Blackwood said quietly, approaching with his remaining servants and carriages, my business in New York requires my return, but I wanted you to know, what happened here has changed everything for me. Sarah looked up from bandaging the wounded soldier. How so, sir? I came to Gettysburg believing that wealth made me superior to common folk. I thought my money could buy respect, loyalty, even love. But Thunder's pride taught me something my millions never could, that true worth cannot be purchased. It must be earned through service to others. Blackwood handed her a leather satchel filled with gold coins. This isn't payment for winning our wager. It's seed money for the hospital I want you to establish here. Pennsylvania will need a place where wounded soldiers can recover, regardless of which uniform they wore. Thunder's pride whinnied softly, as if understanding the significance of the moment. The horse that had cost more than most people's lifetime earnings would remain with the McKenna family, not as a trophy of wealth, but as a symbol of redemption, earned through humble service. as Blackwood's carriage disappeared down the road toward New York. Sarah stood beside Thunder's Pride, watching the last of the wounded soldiers being evacuated. The Battle of Gettysburg was over, but its lessons about the true meaning of honor, sacrifice, and human dignity would resonate for generations to come. For months after the battle, President Abraham Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg to dedicate the National Cemetery where thousands of soldiers now rested. Sarah McKenna stood among the crowd of 20,000 people gathered to hear what would become known as the Gettysburg Address. Thunder's Pride beside her, wearing a simple rope halter instead of his former silver-studded bridle. The McKenna farm had indeed become a hospital, funded by Blackwood's contribution and operated by Sarah with help from army surgeons. The main house served as a recovery ward, while the barn had been converted into a surgical facility. Soldiers from both armies received equal care, their uniforms mattering less than their humanity. Thunder's Pride had adapted completely to his new life. The Arabian stallion that had once pranced in Central Park now pulled a cart carrying medical supplies to outlying farms where wounded soldiers were recovering. His expensive breeding showed in his intelligence and endurance, but his true nobility came from his willingness to serve without regard for status or reward. President Lincoln's voice carried across the battlefield as he spoke the words that would define the meaning of the sacrifice made at Gettysburg. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. Sarah thought of young Thomas Garrett, the Confederate soldier who had died in Blackwood's arms, and the dozens of other boys buried in the cemetery. Lincoln was right. The living could not add to the consecration these men had already provided through their sacrifice. A familiar figure approached through the crowd. Cornelius Blackwood had returned to Gettysburg, but he was barely recognizable as the arrogant millionaire who had arrived 4 months earlier. His expensive clothes had been replaced by simple, practical garments. His soft hands bore the calluses of honest work, and his eyes held a depth that wealth alone could never provide. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I wanted to see what we had built." Together, the hospital had treated over 200 wounded soldiers, saving lives that might otherwise have been lost. More importantly, it had demonstrated that healing could transcend the divisions that had torn the nation apart. Union and Confederate soldiers had recovered side by side, discovering their shared humanity in the face of common suffering. "Thunder's Pride has become quite the local hero," Sarah told Blackwood, stroking the horse's neck. "Children come from miles around just to see the millionaire's horse that chose a farm girl. They don't understand that he didn't choose me. He chose kindness over cruelty, service over selfishness." Blackwood nodded, understanding the deeper truth. He taught us both that true worth cannot be measured in dollars or bloodlines. It can only be measured in how we treat others, especially those who cannot repay us. President Lincoln concluded his brief but immortal address. "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us that, from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah and Blackwood stood together beside Thunder's Pride. 3 unlikely companions brought together by tragedy and transformed by grace. The horse that had once symbolized the vast gulf between rich and poor now represented something far more powerful, the possibility of redemption through service to others. The Battle of Gettysburg had ended the Confederate invasion of the North, but its true victory lay in the transformation of hearts and minds. A millionaire had learned that money could not buy honor. A proud horse had discovered that true nobility came from humility, and a poor farmer's daughter had proven that genuine worth transcended all earthly distinctions in the growing twilight. Thunder's pride bowed his head once more, not in submission but in recognition of the sacred ground where so many had given their lives for the principle that all human beings, regardless of birth or station, possessed equal dignity and worth. The lesson learned at Gettysburg would echo through the ages. True greatness bows before genuine goodness, and the meek shall indeed inherit the earth.